All right. Hello, Zer0 Books readers. It's me, MacManus again. You might remember me as the author of books like What is Postmodern Conservatism? And as one of the co-authors of Myth and Mayhem, a leftist critique of Jordan Peterson. I'm here continuing my ongoing series of interviews with well-known public intellectuals. And today we have Professor Jason Stanley, who is a professor of philosophy at Yale University. Primarily known, I should say, for his work on the philosophy of language in the analytical tradition, which is, some of you might know, is a highly technical subject. But since then, he's become well known for his public excursions on the topic of propaganda, both in an American context and elsewhere, and his recent work on fascism, which is generated a great deal of attention. So thank you very much, Professor Stanley, for joining us here today. And I'm sure this will be a really interesting talk.
Oh, it's great to be here.
Okay. So the first question that I had for you, I guess, is a little bit more biographical. Your main research was in the highly technical philosophy of language. My background is in the philosophy of law. Once upon a time, we do some work on that. It's a highly technical field. What persuaded you to move from the philosophy of language to discussing politics and fascism more directly?
So, my father was a sociology professor at Syracuse University who would regularly teach the social theory class. He would regularly teach Habermas. And he used to make fun of speech act theory of Habermas at the dinner table. He'd say, Habermas thinks speech act theory will save democracy. I guess I took that a little too seriously. So when I went to college, I went to college at 16 after a year in Germany. And I always was interested in Marx and Hegel and Kant, the things one is interested in when one goes into philosophy. After my freshman year, I went to Germany, to university, my second year in Germany, to study Kant and Hegel and read Habermas there. But during my first 2 years as a freshman and sophomore, I discovered philosophy of language immediately and was completely taken in by the clarity of the discussion and the exactitude of the methodology. So I was always had the political interests I do now. I've always had them, and I've always been interested in propaganda. It's just that I've always also thought that you need to do the work the foundational work before you can apply it. What I found, though, is that philosophy of language had certain ideological restrictions that I'm exploring in work that's coming out with Princeton University Press, a book I've been working on for 5 years called The Politics of Language, an essay in non-ideal theory.
That sounds exciting.
Yeah, so that's about how philosophy of language is sort of designed to cut you off from a lot of the interesting questions. Too much of philosophy of language. It's an open question, how much? For instance, in philosophy of language, we assume there's one speaker and one audience. However, in political speech, that's just not true. In political speech, think of the poorly named expression dog whistle. A dog whistle is so named because the idea is there's two audiences, one that hears the message, the hidden message, and the other that just hears the literal content. But actually with that phenomena, there are really three audiences. There's the audience that doesn't hear it. There's the audience that hears the message and doesn't like it. And there's the audience that hears the message and likes it because they know there's an audience that hears the message and doesn't like it. So the phenomenon is such an example like inner city. Like there's a problem of laziness in the inner city. That's a racist dog whistle. Now, many people would hear that, obviously hear it as a racist dog whistle. But the person who says it would deny that they meant anything racist. So that's what's going on with that kind of phenomenon. There's interesting linguistic phenomena happening with Trump because it's so explicit that the idea of a dog whistle seems really not appropriate anymore. But basically, I've always been interested in communication. My foundational interest, I'm a philosopher of language. I'm also an epistemologist. My first book was in epistemology, which was my first published work in epistemology, and I faced the same questions I face now, where people said, you started out as a philosopher of language, how did you end up writing your first book in epistemology? Aren't you going into a field you've never worked in before and things like that? So it's because I'm problem focused rather than discipline focused. I'm interested in how communication works in such a way that we end up tied in knots intellectually. That, you know, the model of discourse you get from a figure like Habermas, where democracy works by the trading of reasons, that's so far from the deliberation or communicative sphere, the informational space in which we find ourselves. The question is, how could things have gone so wrong? So much of philosophy of language is devoted to the question, you know, how do things go right? How do I communicate a message to you that you grasp and then you communicate one back? And, you know, if I believe false things, you correct me. Well, I began to be interested in the question, how do we go so wrong, rather than how do we go so right? So a lot of my work, I mean, ultimately, in a way, I find myself as a philosopher of language and epistemologist throughout. It's just that I think some of the most interesting questions in philosophy of language and epistemology are not about how do you characterize when things go right, but how do you figure out the structure of things going wrong. And then in political communication, we find, and in the political realm, we find a marriage of my two fields, philosophy of language and epistemology. We find, for instance, these epistemic isolation zones, where, you know, as one philosopher called it, epistemic apartheid. I think that was, you know, where we occupy different spheres. We don't, when we regard someone as our enemy, their message is something that we tune off and don't update on at all. So what are the processes by which we come to regard someone as an enemy? What are the linguistic mechanisms by which we can do enemy formation? How do narratives work in the construction of an enemy, so we shut off their feedback and don't listen to them? These are questions in philosophy of language and epistemology. It's just that they're not questions in the philosophy of language and epistemology with which I was raised. However, if you go back to the beginning of philosophy of language, if you go back to, or a bit past the beginning actually, you go back to the 20s and 30s in the program called General Semantics, there were formal semanticists and logicians using technical apparatus to try to figure out how to combat propaganda. And what I'm trying to do in my academic work is use or rather adjust and create new technical apparatuses. That's what I did in my book, How Propaganda Works, and that's what I'm doing especially in my new book with David Beaver, the linguist at University of Texas at Austin. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to figure out how to use the new technical to say, okay, let's abandon certain idealizations and rethink what tools and resources we need, and rethink the foundations of philosophy of language, so we realize there are multiple audiences for a message, that we don't always accommodate the presuppositions of our interlocutor. We often, if we regard them as an enemy, we often do the opposite. If they presuppose something, we reject it. And so in our work that we've been working on for 5 years, we're trying to reconceptualize the philosophy of language. And then I see my public work as the fruits of the technical work that I've been doing.
Well, that sounds very exciting. I mean, when I was an undergraduate student, I was always taken with Hannah Arendt's injunction against the philosophy of language, you know, that it was apolitical and kind of a solipsistic enterprise. And if you were into political theory, what you looked at was, as you put it, man. I mean, it's a problematic term now, but, you know, we'll give her a break. Rather than, you know, individual men, which is what, you know, philosophers of language looked at. And it seems that along with Habermas and other people I can think of, like Charles Taylor, you're doing your best to kind of show how it is that philosophy of language can actually serve a very vital public function in helping us communicate better, and also looking to invoke a Habermasian term at how communication can be distorted by political animosities, propaganda, and all that stuff. Would that be correct to say?
That's absolutely right.
Mhm.
And Arendt is correct as well. We found that there are individualistic assumptions in the philosophy of language. There are many individualistic assumptions in the philosophy of language that one has to abandon. One needs to, the question is, how do we use a framework that's designed to analyze communication between two individuals and generalize it to analyze, say, a political speech where someone is speaking to a large audience. The formation of masses, as it were. That's what you need to do in order to understand what's going on right now. Politics. You need to understand how one person creates a following by speaking to an audience of a lot of people. And so how do we conceptualize that audience? We can't conceptualize that audience as a group of different individuals. It doesn't really work like that. So we need to abandon a number of presumptions. And then the question is, how much does the technical apparatus help you understand what's going on once you do that? And that's still an open question. Sometimes doing this work of rethinking, I find myself wondering, and this is just a confession, how much is what I'm doing helping us understand what's happening versus redescribing it in sort of technical terms. So a lot will depend on how fruitful the analyses that we come up with are. I mean, there's a lot of reason to be hopeful, though. Like, for example, the kind of work that we're doing. So, politeness theory is a sociolinguistic theory that emerged in the 70s and 80s, and it's about how it looks at. So the basic idea is they were trying to explain why people are polite. So why, when you
I
want
should
to
say,
favor,
as a Canadian, that's very important to me, right? I mean, it's practically a national religion for us.
well, I think for Canadians the theory fails. It's a very American theory uh, because it hypothesizes that you're polite because you want something, whereas Canadians are just polite.
Mhm.
So it doesn't. So the idea is you have a positive face, which is your status,
Mhm.
and a negative face, which is how much your freedom is being constrained. And when someone asks a favor of you, they're constraining your freedom. They're asking you to do something for them.
Mhm.
So in order to do that, they puff up your negative face, your positive face, your status. They say, please, sir, kind sir. You know, they elevate your status because they're constraining your freedom by asking you a favor. So it does explain, and it's very powerful, and but it has severe limitations. Some people are polite just to be polite, and so like Canadians. and,
Well, I should say every semester at the end of the year, I get students, right? And of course, it's exactly that kind of format, right? Please, professor, right? Something I'm
yeah,
not mad, I'm always professor at the end of it, my paper, give me an extension or all that kind of stuff. And,
exactly.
I always kind of brush it off. But what you're saying is there's a whole theoretical apparatus that's designed to help explain why these kinds of behaviors are undertaken. And it relates back to people being concerned about infringing my freedom through by asking me a favor. That's quite interesting.
Yes. And Jennifer Aberhart, the great Stanford psychologist, uses politeness theory in her analysis of the Oakland Police Department. So politeness theory has various ways of measuring respect and agency, how much agency you're granting to your interlocutor, how much respect you're granting them. They have by the ways you have of talking. And she was hired by the Oakland Police Department to give an analysis of interactions between white motorists and white police officers, and between police officers and white and black motorists. And what she found is that using politeness theory, you could show that the Oakland Police Department were much less respectful of black motorists than white motorists in their interactions. They showed many fewer markers of respect of positive status. So for instance, you respect someone's autonomy if you ask them to do something, leaving it up to their agency. Can you please give me your registration versus license and registration? Or can you please put your hands on the wheel versus put your hands on the wheel? So that sort of, order versus question, respects it divides along, do you respect the autonomy of your interlocutor or not? So this sort of rather recherche sociolinguistic theory ends up to have positive, important political content. And what I seek to do in my work, what my life's work is about doing the foundational difficult work among, the academics and linguistics and psychology and philosophy and history, and then bringing that to bear to bring fruit, to yield some insight into political discourse. But I think what's a crucial thing for me in my development was I represented this as my attitude all along, and that's not true. But a crucial thing in my development was moving from a discipline-based approach to a problem-based approach. I stopped thinking in terms of what do philosophers think? What do philosophers want me to say? And I started thinking more in terms of, I want to understand propaganda, and I want to understand how democracy disintegrates, how democracy can be eaten out from within. I want to understand these processes. And I don't care what disciplines I have to learn or what areas I have to master in order to understand them. I'm problem-based now, not discipline-based.
Well, I think that's actually a great segue to my next question, which is kind of the real meat and potatoes of our discussion, which is that, again, you become probably best known now, at least in the public, for your work theorizing on fascism, whether you're talking about fascist rhetoric, the history of fascism, how fascists compel or distort the truth. And I was wondering, before we kind of get really in to the nuts and bolts of how you understand fascism, why would you say that this is the appropriate word to invoke in our time period? There are many people who would say, certainly not me, but that it's alarmist. There's a bit of a difference between people like Donald Trump, who is operating in a liberal democracy, and people like Hitler and Mussolini. So why that word? Why is that the word that needs to come back?
Yeah, Hitler never operated in a liberal democracy.
Yeah, there you go.
We need to distinguish between a fascist regime, which the United States is not, and Weimar Germany was not. So Weimar Germany was not a fascist regime. And so if you're talking about 1931 in Germany, have you been using the term fascist? Well, you could have been using the term fascist. You could have been talking about a fascist social and political movement as embodied by a party, the Nazi Party. So you can talk about fascist regimes, and you can talk about fascist social political movements. And then third, you can talk about fascist tactics or you can talk about fascist tactics. Fascist tactics could be used by people who aren't even part of a social and political movement. They're just using fascist tactics because they have some purchase and efficacy in the electoral process in gaining votes, or more likely taking over a system for your own advantage. So if we're talking about fascist regimes, I think that's less relevant for today. If we're talking about, although that would be a worry that we would have about the results of if some of the forces in various societies were let free. If we're talking about,
it's worth noting, of course, that Trump has recently said that they might want to either cancel or delay the 2020 election, right? And that's certainly a sign, right?
Oh yeah, today he openly said he's going after the post office to try to tamp down on votes. So he openly declared that his attack on the post office is there because he's trying to rig the election. So, and everyone now, everyone is doing elections, and, in Belarus, they had an election Are we going to say Belarus is democratic? I mean, they had a rigged election. So, Hungary has no free press at all, but they have elections. So, the idea that we have long had rigged elections. Georgia almost certainly, or very probably, had a rigged gubernatorial election to elect Brian Kemp, who was running for governor when he was running the election as well, the secretary in charge of the election as well. So we have a long history of rigged elections. I mean, we didn't allow Black Americans to vote in the South until very recently. Felon disenfranchisement is rigging. 1.1, over 1 million voters in Florida can't vote because they're felons, and then they're former felons, and then they voted to. So we have massive election rigging in this country. And my work is not about Donald Trump. My work is about the long history of fascist forces in our country and elsewhere. So Donald Trump is much more of a symptom than a cause, and he himself doesn't have any kind of fascist vision. He's just more of a tin pot wannabe autocrat type who appeals to fascist tactics and politics. Tom Cotton is much more in the line of what the Fox News. I'm blanking. Tucker Carlson. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Those are people with much more of a vision. But we need to be talking about. So the issue is not a fascist regime. Mm-hmm. The issue is the Republican Party becoming something like containing within it a fascist social and political movement? Mm-hmm. And are we seeing fascist tactics that undermine democracy from within and transform the character of a regime into an anti-democratic, non-democratic regime? And these are not foreign to the United States. My work, when I talk about examples of fascist tactics in my book, the kinds of people I appeal to who are using them are people like Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton. These are not Donald Trump. Some of them are not even Republicans.
I've often said that, if you have a country where 6.6 million people can't vote because they were felons, mostly African Americans and mostly on drug-related charges, that's about the size of a moderate European country, right? We're not talking about small numbers here, right?
Our incarceration rate is among the highest of any society in history. It parallels Stalin in the USSR in the early 1950s. 730 to 750 per 100,000 compared to the 80 to 150 per 100,000 of other liberal democracies. So, there's not a close second in our incarceration rate. Black Americans are almost 10% of the world's prison population, despite being only 40 million people. So we already entered the anti-democratic crisis in which we find ourselves in a bad position. Massive wealth inequality that requires anti-democratic measures in order to make sure that the will of the people is not realized. People, generally, large majorities want taxes on super wealthy people. Generally, they want health care. Generally, they want many things that policy elites aren't giving us. So in order to stymie that, you need anti-democratic measures. Now, not all of those anti-democratic measures are, I would call, fascist. Some of them are just anti-democratic. Where fascism comes in is in a particular racially driven vision of society, where there's based on a racial hierarchy. And Trump is and using methods like incarceration, militarism. Fascism comes in at the collapse of empire, at the end of empire. In case anyone wants to know what the name for the feeling that we have here is, it's death of empire.
Yeah.
and so these are times when the war on terror was an imperial war, a failed imperial war that brought its warriors back to wage an anti-Muslim campaign here. The character of the attacks on Islam that one finds in the United States mirror to a large degree the protocols of the Elders of Zion. The communists / Muslims want Sharia law. So we're seeing a lot of the hallmark elements of fascist ideology, fascist propaganda, and that's what my work in the first instance concerns. But we're also seeing the transformation of our country with ICE, which is and the Customs and Border Patrol, an organization that is devoted to distinguishing the citizen from the non-citizen, and now in Portland and elsewhere has been turned against the president's political opponents. We're seeing the development of fascist forces. When you look at the attack on immigration laws, what does Hitler admire about the United States in Mein Kampf? Hitler admires our immigration, our then restrictive immigration laws. People who were less alarmist said in 2017, what do we have to worry about? The Supreme Court got rid of denied the Muslim ban. Well, hey, folks, the Supreme Court, the Muslim ban has long been U.S. law now. All they had to do was fake and add a couple countries that were not majority Muslim to the travel ban, and we got the Muslim travel ban. And now we've added several countries like Tanzania and Nigeria that are just black majority countries. So our immigration laws, our citizenship laws are being changed and attacked. So we're seeing a lot of the fundamental elements of fascist ideology being realized in policy.
Excellent. So this brings me up to actually something that's a little bit more aligned with the philosophy of language, but also what we've been talking about before. And there have been a lot of terms thrown around to kind of describe the language or the rhetorical strategies that are used by contemporary fascist parties. You've seen things like sophism, disinformation. I prefer Harry Frankfurt's term bullshit, the technical sense, where he talks about how it is that a bullshitter, unlike a liar, is just as interested in the truth, has no conception of truth or falsity whatsoever. Can you clarify for us a little bit about how contemporary fascists in our 21st century epoch deploy language and rhetoric, and how is that best understood using the philosophy of language?
So on November 4th, 2016, I published an article in the New York Times that was the most read article the weekend before the election. Didn't do much good, but it's called Beyond Lying, Donald Trump's Authoritarian Rhetoric. And in it, I criticized the media for not understanding that what was going on with Trump's speech acts. They kept on thinking that he would be punished or sanctioned for lying. They kept on waiting for a moment to come where the American people would say, "Oh, he's lying to us. Let's punish him." And that moment never came. And that moment never came because his supporters liked the lies. His supporters liked the lies. That's what they liked.
That's almost a paradoxical term, idea, right? And I think this is what people have a hard time understanding, right? Like, how could you like to be lied to, right? It seems patronizing. It seems to suggest that you're unintelligent, right?
Because they didn't think he was lying to them. They thought he was lying to the press, to the liberal elites. They thought he was getting away with it because it's all about owning the libs. Jonathan Metzl has a great book called Dying of Whiteness, where he talks about how people would rather die than see their political enemies, in this case, black people, get various goods. Well, here, what we have is people don't care about what they themselves are getting. They just want to see the liberal elite get humiliated and dominated. And so he's not lying to them, he's lying to the liberal elite. And so, and then he tells them that the liberal elite have been lying to them, which is not wildly false, unfortunately. So he had the Gulf War to run on. He had all these failures of the liberal elite, which is why it's so dangerous to screw up in the way the Democratic Party makes it its job to screw up.
I know they do find a way to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory time after time, right? And to
Well,
do
they
so in
just
a very
hand it over
unprincipled
to the
way.
bankers and the conservatives and they just, they just, they feed from the trough. They're as corrupt as anyone else. And so that's the problem. Like, how do you have a country where the presidents constantly leave with $100 million or more? Like in any other country, that would be called corruption. Bloomberg, that they minimize the forces of progressive change. They maximize the banks, the corporate elements, and so naturally we face fascism, because naturally someone can come and say, "Hey, the elite are corrupt," and they're right. So that's another question. That's another issue. But Trump came and said the elite are corrupt, and he was quite right. And then he said, then he lied, and that was enjoyable. It showed that he was authentic. So so there's a great piece by Ezra Zuckerman Savan and co-author called "The Authentic Appeal of the Lying Demagogue." And what he shows is that it's a psychology experiment. What he shows is that if people think, if they're watching a screen and they're asked whether people are authentic, and they see one person playing a fair game and the person's cheating, and they're asked if he's authentic, and they say no, he's a cheater. But if the game is clearly rigged, then the person who is lying all the time and cheating, they think is most authentic. So if you can convince people that the game is rigged, and if in fact the game is rigged, which it is, in favor of billionaires and the super wealthy, the banks crashed the economy and then got, all paid back, and so by the government. If you can convince people the system is corrupt, then your corruption will be seen as your open corruption will be seen as authenticity. And that's what happened with Donald Trump. His open corruption is seen by his supporters as authenticity. He's our corrupt person. At least he's openly corrupt. At least when he says he's going to rig the election, he just says it. Trump is, I'll give him that. He says it and he means it. So he tells us all the time he's going to stay in power. He's going to try to stay in power. So that's one part of it. He's not lying.
Can I just clarify then? So the argument would
I
be
also want to criticize bullshit, as I not like that concept.
Okay, I just always found it was an entertaining essay, but what you're saying is then that Trump doesn't necessarily have a kind of personal integrity behind his speech act, but he has a kind of bizarre authenticity. Is that the right word? Because he's a corrupt person who's nonetheless at least consistent in his corruption, and he's also willing to say things that seem true about the corruption endemic of the system and kind of embrace his status as a product of that. Is that right?
Yes. And then he's seen as authentic, because the people who are, giving Goldman Sachs speeches for hundreds of thousands of dollars and claim not to be corrupt, well, why is a 45-minute speech worth $300,000? Like, that seems an awful, a very strange, and non-corrupt thing. So he feeds off. This is why, in order to fend off fascism, because all fascist campaigns are anti-corruption campaigns. That's one thing I talk about in my book, that they're all anti-corruption campaigns. In order to fend off fascism, you can't have so much corruption. Now just getting to bullshit. So Frankfurt talks about bullshit as, unmoored from the truth, not caring about the truth. I don't think that's a correct characterization of what's going on. The term bullshit, I mean, it seems to me the term bullshit goes with bullshitter, bullshitting. Was Hitler really bullshitting? I don't think so. I think that's a really almost offensive way to describe Hitler's propaganda. It was much worse than bullshit. It wasn't simply not caring about the truth. It was something else was going on. You're getting the description wrong. And then there's another aspect, something that I explore in my book with David Beaver, which is power. When Trump audaciously lies, he's daring people to challenge him. And so you see this particularly when female reporters, and very particularly when Black female reporters, challenge him. it doesn't matter what the content is. They're challenging him. And
would an example be like the recent reporter who chastised him about COVID? That's the one that comes to mind.
Yeah, that was Paula. Oh no, I mean, it happened. That was about the veterans bill. But yeah, I mean, it happens all the time. So that Yamiche, one of the reporters, Yamiche Alcindor, regularly challenges him, and he regularly responds to her, not with the content, because the content is irrelevant, but it's that she challenged him. And the audacious lies, the idea is you send the audacious lies out there, and then the supporters cheer because he can get the audacious lies past the hated liberal elite and defend them, even though, you know, they're audacious lies. And then what you do, though, is you destroy the ground for any kind of deliberative democracy, and you replace in its stead the kind of conspiracy theorizing that we're seeing dominate our sphere today. I mean, the very first piece I ever published in the New York Times in 2012 was on birtherism, because I was like, you know, that's an extremely disturbing, you know, what conspiracy theories do is they remove the possibility of any kind of intelligent interchange. Because if the other person is really just trying to cover up for a pedophilic sex ring, then, you know, or they're a traitorous, you know, a traitorous person trying to bring Sharia law to the country, as Ali Hassan Ali has been saying about Biden lately, then whatever they're saying, actually saying, is irrelevant. You already know their goal, which is, you know, to pedophilia or to bring down the United States. You already
Gay
know
frogs,
that.
right?
Or what?
Gay frogs. Remember, Alex Jones had that one for a while.
Right. So you already know that. So then what they're saying is irrelevant. They're just mistrustworthy sorts from the very beginning.
Okay. Well, thank you. That really clarifies a lot of things. And I find this paradox really fascinating about how Trump can almost present himself as an authentic figure, precisely by embracing the corruption endemic of the system and almost reveling in it, rather than dissociating it from himself, which leads people to be distrustful of him. I think that's a really interesting theoretical point. And actually, if I were to write my own book on this again, on postmodern conservatism, I wish I could change a few things, because actually it seems really very insightful. But we'll have another chat about that at a different time, actually.
That's great.
My last question for you then is just kind of a very broad one, and probably enough for Zer0 Books. It involves a Marx quote. So Marx, in the Theses on Feuerbach, said that the philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world, but the point is to change it. What role do you see philosophy, or theory, if you want to be more general, in playing in helping us to both understand and to combat our current troubles? Is it an important thing to be doing this kind of theorizing and philosophizing? And if so, what is that?
So I see my technical work that only academics see as a kind of proving ground for the public work that I do. The public work that I do and the analysis that I do is, I think, the most important work, but it has to be responsible and responsive to, it has to be correct. And so I see the academic minutia that I'm engaged in as sort of the foundations for the public work. What I think is kind of odd in a way is academic work that is about these issues of social and political import, but never connects to public work. I mean, I find it incredibly valuable for my public work to do my academic work. My academic work that lays bare the details, the formal details of how propagandistic communication functions, and bringing to, and I find it incredibly useful and vital to be challenged by other academics, like, how is this fascism? How does it compare to this and this? And how exactly does this this kind of propaganda work on a detailed level, and your theory doesn't work for such and such reasons. All that is incredibly valuable because it ultimately informs the analysis that I'm giving in more publicly accessible ways in my articles and interviews. But if it were just, theory for theory's sake, I'm not sure really what the point is. At that point, I might be going back to, say, my work on, quantifier domain restriction or different kinds of formal semantic content and modal operators. So I think the theory we do is vital. It's vital to understand. Like, take Angela Davis. I mean, Angela Davis has had an immense influence on academia and the world. I mean, we all remember in the 1990s when prison abolition was considered just a way out there view. And then suddenly prison abolition is now something that's taken very seriously, that that law schools have now people working on restorative justice and alternative frameworks. And that's work that couldn't have been done without the theory. Like, without Foucault and without Davis's work, without looking back at history and seeing that the prison, in fact, has not always been part of society. I mean, you need historians, you need to do archival research, and you need to do history in order to understand that the prison is not a permanent feature of America, of world societies, of human societies. So to understand what's local and what's not, you need to do academic work. To understand what generalizes and what doesn't, you need to do academic work. And there's going to be a lot of academic work that has to be done with other academics. But ultimately, it needs to be linked to activism, and it needs to be linked to public communication in the forms of public philosophy, public writing and communication, and education systems like high schools and colleges. So I think there is a huge role for theory, but not theory in isolation, I guess I want to say. But without doing theory, without doing the academic work, I'm not seeing how say Are Prisons Obsolete could have been written without a lot of theoretical reflection.
Absolutely, and I should say, certainly at Zer0 Books, we share your enthusiasm for engaged theory, right? Theory can change the world, ideas can change the world, and they should be good ideas and well thought out, but they should try to be disseminated in an entertaining and accessible way to make them live. So thank you so much, Professor Stanley. It was a real pleasure. I certainly learned a lot, and we're looking forward to this new opus of yours that'll be coming out. You've been working on it for 5 years. Is there a release date on that, by any chance?
I'm on leave this fall, and I'm going to try to get it finally done. It's with Princeton University Press, right. So with David Beaver, and we'll probably follow it up with a trade book or a crossover book that is more applied to the current political situation we face.
Okay, excellent. Well, we're looking forward to that, and I'll make sure that the links to your most recent books are up there as well. But I hope you have a good day, and I hope our paths cross again.
Thank you very much. Great conversation.
Cheers. Bye-bye.